Okay. So I'm Grant Wilson. I am the directing attorney of Earth Law Center, and we're a nonprofit advocacy group in the United States. I'm personally in Boulder, Colorado, but we have associates all over the world. And thank you so much to everyone for joining me and to everyone involved in organizing and presenting at these webinars. Let's see, okay. I think I muted someone. So I'll start with a brief introduction and then we will move on to our esteemed speakers. We'll go for an hour today at the very longest, and then we'll move to Q&A for up to 30 minutes. And I predict we'll end early, which is something I always like to do with these conferences. And a reminder once again to please mute if you're not. So this webinar is part of a larger series hosted by the Ecological Law and Governance Association in partnership with the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and a number of other organizations. The overarching theme is ecological law and governance. And so this is basically an earth-centered approach to our legal system. The focus is on upholding the overall ecological integrity of our planet. And it also acknowledges and values the connections between humans and all life on Earth, and seeks to re-envision our relationship with nature. And so a lot of the previous webinars in the series, which are all amazing and available online, by the way, I encourage you to go back and watch them. They have focused on the what. What does education need to look like to achieve the types of paradigm shifts in law that we want to see? What does a post-extractivism economy look like? What would it mean to give legal rights to the oceans? And all these topics, they certainly also address the how. How do we get there? But today's session is a little different in that it'll focus specifically on how everyone, us, can fight for these legal shifts, specifically through advocacy and activism. And some of what you will hear here today is general, it's theory. Some is case studies, how frontline advocates and activists are fighting for a better planet in practice. And in general, I think you'll see that sometimes we are winning. The advocacy and activism has succeeded in passing new ecocentric laws that require protecting the planet, that mandate strong sustainability practices. And other times we're not succeeding. The opposition has been too great and the problem too difficult to overcome. But what can we learn and what can we do better is our goal. And it's important to acknowledge, due to the topic of this webinar, that also the opposition of the environmental movement has been so great that there has been significant violence and even murder perpetrated against defenders of the environment and put their own well-being at risk. And there's a report I encourage everyone to read from Global Witness, and its most recent report found that every single day, on average, 3 environmental defenders were murdered. I'm sorry, not every day, every week. It's still enormously large. Environmental defenders were murdered in 2018. This is particularly true for environmental defenders in many developing countries, although also developed ones, and for indigenous peoples who are disproportionately impacted by mining and other destructive practices, and against whom violence is perpetrated in disproportionately large amounts. And so I want to acknowledge the sacrifices of these activists due to the theme of our talk today. So go and learn more from Global Witness, or Earth Law Center has a report. You can go to our webpage on co-violations of human rights and rights of nature. But overall, I think if we're going to succeed in changing the law and the culture in a way that creates a thriving planet, as many of us envision, we need to have effective advocacy. We need to have effective activism. That's supremely important. And today we are going to learn exactly about that. So with that introduction, I'll get to our first speaker. I do ask that you reserve questions until the end of the presentations. And also quickly, looking at this note here, there's a sign-in sheet. You'll see it there. Google Docs link, if everyone could click that and sign in. That'll be a great way to get you more information, to make sure you have links to the previous webinars and that sort of thing. The other little note is that I see I've been named Michelle Bender. Hi, Michelle. She's my amazing coworker. My name is Grant Wilson, as I said. Work on fixing that later on, but I'm honored to be Michelle Bender in the meanwhile. So let me introduce the first speaker. That's Jen Gabby. And Jen Gabby is an activist scholar. She's based in Montreal, or Jojagwe. She's the founder of the Mud Girls Natural Building Collective, organizes with Climate Justice Montreal, and is currently completing her PhD at McGill University in the economics for the Anthropocene project. This fall, she will begin a postdoctorate fellowship at Concordia University. Her work focuses on collaborative thinking with activists, land defenders, and other change makers to devise and experiment with innovative and powerful approaches to driving radical transformation in Canada, both towards social justice and ecological sustainability. She will present on theories of change and how transforming our law and governance systems will happen. Welcome, Jen, and thank you for being here today.
Hi there. Hi. I'm going to share my screen because I do have some slides. So let's do that. Just let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, we see it.
Great. Okay. So yes, I live in Canada. I'm born and raised here. And currently, Canada is continuing to expand its oil and gas industries, continue to have its economy based on oil and gas despite the climate crisis and despite its commitments to reconciliation with Indigenous people. So the tar sands in Alberta are the biggest industrial, the most polluting industrial project in the world, and they're continuing to expand it in part through expansion of pipeline networks to get the bitumen oil to the coast. And so this has been, this has sparked response and resistance from social movements in Canada, largely led by Indigenous communities on the front lines of both climate change and extractive development. And so there's been movements coming together, Indigenous movements, environmental movements, social justice movements coming together to resist these pipelines over the last decade or so. And these are the movements that I'm involved with as a climate justice activist in Canada, but I've also been involved for the last 5 years as a researcher, working as an activist and a researcher. And I've been working with these movements who are coming together to resist pipelines. And my research has been really focused on how does large-scale systemic change that we're looking to bring about, how does that kind of change happen? And how are movements in Canada currently doing at bringing that change about? So my main method has been thinking with activists, collaborative thinking and reflection. I think someone needs to mute themselves. I don't know who that is. I'll keep going. And so I'm going to share with you some of the findings from my research that I've done on understanding change with these social movements that I'm part of in Canada. So one thing to start out by saying is that when we say change and theories of change, it's so broad, it almost means nothing. And so just to be clear, when I'm talking about change, I'm talking about the kind of change that these movements and myself are interested in. So this is change that addresses both ecological and social dimensions of the crisis, that targets root causes, that brings about transformation of systems, not just specific policies or specific institution. Change that involves a fundamental shift in the balance of power, change that can be brought about from the bottom up, and change that is led by the people who are most impacted by the crises and informed by diverse worldviews and ways of knowing and being. So that's the kind of change I'm talking about. And in terms of how change happens, can you see that whole slide, or is this thing in your way?
I see the whole red box.
Great. Okay. So in my many interviews, surveys, and think tank sessions, I asked people, how do you think large-scale systemic change happens? And I gathered all these many diverse theories of change and assembled them into this theory of change. Well, it's really like a whole chapter in my thesis, which I've summarized in this graphic here. So the idea here is that system transformation can happen when there's alignment amongst the context, the way we understand and how we value, the actions we take, and the ways we relate to each other. So I'll go a bit briefly into this before moving on, but the idea with the context is that timing really matters, that what works strategically at one time may not work 3 years or a decade later due to shifting political conditions or material conditions, whatever it is, and that events, sometimes crisis events, can open up, make the system more amenable to change and at other times, and sometimes such that change becomes necessary. So being attentive to context is critical in terms of being able to strategize for transformative change. But also, that's not enough on its own. It's also important how people understand what we value. So how we understand our place on Earth, our relations with each other, how we understand the crises, and how we envision solutions. So this is the work of education systems and narrative change and developing shared systemic analysis. And it's about learning from people who are most impacted and amplifying those voices. And in Canada, it's definitely taking the form of learning from Indigenous leadership about these shifts in values and understandings. So that's also necessary but insufficient. It also really matters how we take action. So take action is about playing power through collective action. So that's mobilizing, organizing, running campaigns where we're building people power. So movements build people power. I like to think of it like building a fire hose of people power, and then where we direct that hose, that's a little controversial. We don't all agree on where we should focus that hose of people power. Some people think, especially right now in Canada with a federal election coming up, that it's really important to focus that people power on engaging with the electoral system and shifting those electoral outcomes. Other people think, well, no, that's not going to be the kind of systemic change we need. The political system will never bring that about, so we need to confront and dismantle power. That's where we need to direct people power. And less controversially, most people agree that we also need to focus that on creating and promoting the alternative ways of living. So, but even action, building collective power and waging change that way is not enough. It also matters how we relate. If we have all these different initiatives and movements and sectoral projects going on, that's not enough. We need to coordinate by sharing information and resources. And to coordinate on this scale, we need to build strong relationships of solidarity. And to build those strong relations, we need to be undoing relations of domination, of sexism, of racism, etc., within our movements and more broadly. So when we come with all these together, it starts to become the possibility for systemic transformation as we have building up pressure in many directions. So that's the theory of change we constructed, that I did construct through many, many conversations with activists in these movements in Canada. But I also had another thing I did, which was develop or do this giant literature review on theories of change from across many bodies of literature, including social ecological transformations, intersectional feminism, historical materialism, social movement studies, and Indigenous scholarship on resistance and resurgence. And from that, that's a 100-page document, the literature review, which I've distilled down to 8 lessons for activists, 8 key lessons for activists about change. And so I'm going to share them quickly with you, and then I'll just make some broad conclusions and finish up. So the first key lesson, to change the system, we need to understand the systems we're part of, and we need to think in systems. So the idea here is that human struggles for change happen within the context of complex systems that are continuously changing in ways that are unpredictable, shaping and being shaped by many diverse factors. So that means we need to think in these ways that understand nonlinearity, that understand that there's going to be unintended consequences or unintended impacts of our work. So the idea here is we need to be thinking about feedbacks, we need to be thinking in the big picture, and we need to be attending to feedback mechanisms to know whether what we're doing is working or not working. So that's a whole important thing. A second key lesson, that there are many kinds of change, and it's helpful to know exactly what kind of change you're working to bring about. So in the literature, there's transitions, adaptations, transformations, there's radical change, there's reformist change, there's individual change, there's systemic change, formal, informal change. You see where I'm going with that? There's many kinds of change, and even with people we're working with closely in movements, we might be thinking about different kinds of change. So it's important to think about exactly what kind of change you're talking about, because that actually can really has implications for which strategies you should choose and which agents are best positioned to act and who you should be allying with. So different forms of change mean different things. So Lesson 3, there are multiple stages of change processes, and different stages call for different strategies and agents. So this is similar to lesson 2, but this one is about at different stages of a transformation. Some stages are more disruptive, where you're going to have the more sort of radical activists creating tensions and conflicts that are going to open up. But then later, maybe in the process, you're going to need people who are working to institutionalize the changes in the systems, and maybe you need different kind of actors there. So being really attentive to where you are in a process of systemic change is really important. Lesson 4, this is a big, often a debate in the scholarly literature, but this idea of what matters more, the material factors or the more cultural ideational factors in making change. So a lot of people really emphasize that it really matters how we pool and allocate resources in movements, and that really determines whether we win or we don't. Other people really emphasize the way identities are formed in movements, the way we shift a sense of belonging and meaning, and the ways we frame the problems and the solutions really, really matter. But the lesson here is that all that really matters. So getting beyond thinking about just material or just cultural. Lesson 5, there are many approaches to making change, and different approaches can work together to build power. So for example, there's people who really focus on the resistance. There's people who focus on education or solidarity building or building the alternatives, or going on the defense, like defending our territories or our lands or our regions from unwanted development. Other people focus on the offense, going to actively dismantle the systems that we don't want. So these are different approaches. They're all extremely important. And the idea here is being able to collaborate across. So people who are doing the resist also working with people who are working on their alternatives. These can be very powerful. Lesson 6, this is very important to think about why change doesn't happen. So did someone just say something? Did I miss something? Okay. So why change doesn't happen. There's many reasons why change happens, but some institutions that are acting as barriers to change, sometimes it's ideas, and often it's interests, it's vested interests. So strategies that target these institutions' ideas and interests are very important. Coming up to our last 2 lessons, key lessons, power is key to change. This is very intuitive. I think we all feel that. But yeah, power is wielded and functions in a variety of ways, from direct to more indirect ways. There's lots of scholarship out there trying to understand how power works and how it relates to change, but there's visible, hidden, and invisible power. There's power within, power with, power over, power to do. And it's important to analyze power. This is crucial for designing effective change strategies, understanding who has the power and what it'll take to shift those power relations. And also understanding the way power dynamics work within our movements is really important, and the way power works through classism, racism, and sexism, and also to undo those forms of power within our movements and across our movements. That's key to building the kind of power necessary to build really powerful movements that can act as counter power to the vested interests of the elite. So finally, relationships are at the heart of transformative change. This idea that capitalism has rendered us all individualists. I don't mean to generalize, not all of us, and not fully, but it really promotes this idea that we're individuals and that we should act in self-interest. And it's kind of made us not great. It hasn't given us the skills to really collaborate, to live together, to work together, to make decisions together on these really big levels that we're trying to do in movements on the ground. And so relearning relational skills to actually be able to work together is a key thing. That came across, that was really present in the Indigenous scholarship, as well as other scholar I read. So in general, this is my last slide. There's generally coming out of my research and these conversations with movements is that we need to think and act more holistically and in ways that account for and integrate and include much more than our current modes of activism and understanding of change facilitate. So I've been really thinking through, and if anyone wants to read any more detail, I can send you my thesis or my summary report of my thesis. But this idea that systemic change requires us all to become better at thinking and working across difference. So thinking across difference in terms of working across different forms of change, the more radical and the more reformist activists being able to find ways to work together more that's mutually beneficial, find solutions that are intersectional, that are not just addressing the ecological crisis, but also addressing classism, racism, sexism, etc. And just being able to also become better at working across difference relationally. That's not easy, and we got to build those skills. But not in a way, I'm not saying let's all work together, everyone. We just, like, clearly I'm not advocating working with racists or the far right. That's not what I'm asking. I'm talking about a critical holism. So now this has all been specific to the Canadian context and to fighting extractivism and colonial capitalism in Canada. But I'm also interested to know how these ideas resonate in the movements that the other panelists and the participants on this webinar are working on. So I'm curious to hear about what's working, the movements you're part of, and what that's teaching you about change. And I'd like to thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to stop sharing and mute.
Wonderful. That was great. Thank you so much for coming and presenting. And, you know, this makes me realize that part of advocacy and activism is just getting out there and making your voices heard. Sure, showing up to rallies, showing up to town hall meetings. But another part, if we were to successfully protect the planet against all odds, is being very strategic, is being conscious of the goals and practices of our advocacy, and is challenging our own assumptions and relationships in our advocacy. And so just as all life on our planet is deeply interconnected, so too must our approaches to activism and advocacy. So thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Our second speaker is Pierre Raman, and he is a UK activist lawyer who previously worked at a London law office specializing in planning and public law before setting up his own practice centered on building civic and ecological resilience. New Economy Law, which is neweconomylaw.org if you want to visit. His clients include community councils in Scotland who successfully defended themselves against major fracking operations. And he will talk about the Extinction Rebellion, or XR, a movement that began in the UK and through the successful deployment of its theory of change has had a high impact in raising mass public awareness around the urgency of climate change, leading to the declarations of a climate and ecological emergency by local councils in the UK Parliament. And Pierre was part of XR's core strategy teams and a spokesperson for the movement. So thank you, and welcome today to our webinar. And I will turn it over to you.
Am I unmuted now? Can you hear me?
I hear you, yep.
Ah, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hello. That was a great talk, Jen. Thank you very much. And I can see lots of connections between your ways of thinking and Extinction Rebellion. I'm just going to share my screen as well. I'm just trying to, we've got some slides together. The first slide is actually the Time Is Now tour. When just when Grant was talking about, you know, we've got to go out to those places. Part of this tour, The Time Is Now, was taking these slides to community centres, to local groups, and building the civil society capacity and bringing the message of Extinction Rebellion through it. And you can see the symbol there of Extinction Rebellion, and the artistry involved, the artistic element has been really key actually to getting the message across and through people in different ways other than just through words. So just as a kind of overview, I'll be talking about just the growth of the movement. I don't know if everybody's heard about Extinction Rebellion. It's a little bit about its theory of change and its three demands, and its structure, the way in which it's gone about implementing its theory of change. Here's some pictures, photographs just of the movement itself. So as you can see, the movement has been very active and creative in how it's carried out its civil disobedience. So putting a boat right in the middle of Oxford Circus, you know, one of the busiest places in London, as a peaceful civil disobedience, having almost like a festive feeling about it has been a key element of that. And you can see there in front of the Royal Courts of Justice making ecocide law, and we had again singers and musicians and speakers coming to bring the message in very clear, ordinary language and in song, and in so that we trying to engage every element of civil society. So it spreads through people. People see it on the media. So the media messaging element has been very important. That was at as you can see there, the scribble of the symbol there, which is Extinction Rebellion symbol, which has been about the Earth and about time running out. And Gail Bradbrook there, who's one of the co-founders, is there in front of the business for environment and environment and industrial strategy. And that was at the very beginning. That was a photo when I took when I wasn't even quite sure whether I wanted to belong in the movement in September last year. But seeing how it carried itself out is what made me, and its values and principles is what made me decide to come to the movement. And I've noted that the values and principles by which Extinction Rebellion holds itself has been one of the key things that has brought lots of people along. So in its theory of change, you could say there are three key logics to its way of thinking about how to create system change. One is disruption to the power structures, which was mentioned earlier. I'll go into that in more detail. Two, and I'll go in more detail in each of these elements. Two, the notion of sacrifice that people are seeing, the archetypal idea of, as we're reaching towards this end game in a way, that we bring out archetypal stories of that people can feel a narrative and an energy towards. And the third element is this kind of idea of not working with the police, but transparency towards holding ourselves in respect to how we engage. So it's not seen as an against, but we're struggling against, but we're struggling with, that we're trying to bring and broaden out how we, from ourselves, about our values and the care that we want to see in the world, and we bring that out through our movement. So number one, disruption. So Roger Hallam was one of the co-founders as well. Roger Hallam is he's an organic farmer in his work, but he became an activist and became studying a PhD because of the changes in temperature was not allowing him to do what he really wanted and loved to do, and so he became he's doing a PhD at UCL, and he built this theory of change, which was around him studying lots of Erica Chenoweth's work around civil non-resistance as a way of change. Paul Engler's book called "This Is an Uprising," and a lot of them talk about all the theories are about. What he noticed was that there's a moment in non-linear systems when there have been a number of arrests in a civil society, in a peaceful civil disobedience. After a certain place, there's a kind of a tipping point where everything begins to change, where prior to that, nothing much is changing, and then everything changes. And so his theory of change was built around this, and that was integrated into Extinction Rebellion around that if we get around 3.5% of the population behind the movement, and a much smaller number of that who are willing to be arrested, and they do get arrested, then that creates that tipping point where suddenly there's a shift in the power structures and things have changed. And that comes from Paul Engler's work and Erica Chenoweth's work, but most of that work has been done in regimes which are more totalitarian. So there's a difference there between the UK and those regimes. But what we've noticed in the uprising that happened in April, and I'll go into that in more detail, is that there was a shift that happened, and that's what brought more people into the movement, building up to what will be now the October International Rebellion. So the disruption is caused. So the other part of that element of the disruption is that it's trying to create a dilemma situation for the political power. So by blocking roads in peaceful non-resistance, as you can see here, and blocking off key areas. Here we were blocking off the whole of the central London. It creates an economic disruption as well. So then you also have lots, because of the economic disruption, you have the police the government in a dilemma situation of either arresting everybody, and that could be 1,000 or more people who are all peacefully demonstrating, or allowing the disruption to continue, which then has an economic hit. And so that's the difference between mass mobilization over a march, for example, because we had it during the prior to the Iraq War, there was over 1 million people marching, but then we all go away. So there's no economic disruption. There's no friction with the status quo. And by doing it this way, by causing that disruption, we create that friction and that dilemma for the police whether to arrest everybody. And over in the April Rebellion, over 1,000 people sacrificed their own freedom in that way of being arrested peacefully. So, and the police this was a key aspect of the UK, at least the UK's strategy, was that we were speaking with the police very transparently about what we were doing in order to say that this was our right to peaceful protest, and the police were seeing it in that capacity. And the arrests were done over in quite a structured way, and they had to bring more and more police for further and further out to enable themselves to be able to administratively just enable themselves to arrest the people. And that was over 1,000 people. So that was causing a lot of disruption, both economically as well. And that number of arrests was bringing the media's attention in as well. And so it began being covered on the BBC and the Guardian, many different newspapers. The foresights we had was not just Oxford Circus, but also Waterloo Bridge, Marble Arch, and Westminster. And each of them had a different theme. So we had the theme of Act Now, which was the boats, which was about acting now, telling the truth. On Marble Arch, there was the theme of telling the truth. One was telling the truth, and Parliament Square was the government to act and put in a climate and ecological emergency. So that's the element of sacrifice, and the respect that comes from the values and principles of XR. And there are 10 values and principles by which we say if you all agree to these values, then you can be part of XR, and we work in a very decentralized way to enable agency in local groups. And the demands were very important as well, that we needed to have very clear demands. So one of the criticisms of the Occupy movement, for example, was that it didn't have any demands, and it the energy kind of dissipated. So here we were trying to build clear, precise demands that could be acted upon. So demand one, that the government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency of change, which is the tell the truth. So we also narrowed them down into very simple phrases that people can repeat and hold in themselves. So act now, that government must act now to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. So giving a very strict deadline that needs to be done by. And demand 3, government must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. And on that first demand, the climate and ecological emergency, that was almost changed the narrative, because up to the narrative has often been around sustainable development, and we were trying to change the narrative to talking about an emergency, so moving the trajectory from climate collapse and finding a different trajectory that would be during an emergency period, almost like within a wartime frame thinking, where we're in this emergency and we need to have different kinds of policies for this time to move that trajectory. And that emergency period of policies, one of these was the end game is to get to that net zero. And the way in which to do that was to create the Citizens' Assembly as a political process. And that Citizens' Assembly has been used in Ireland and a number of other, I think Canada as well, but it's quite a formal process. And the idea is that to democratize the political systems as they stand now, and we're seeing this in Brexit, we're seeing this in the UK, where political power has been narrowed and focused, and people don't feel empowered anymore. So the Citizens Assembly is to say, why can't citizens themselves come to good decisions if they're given the right information? So the method of sortition is used, which is a random selection of people, a bit like a jury, but choosing, say, around 100 people to represent the demographics of a country, and they come together and the experts come in to give information on particular themes. The Citizens Assembly is the body that makes the actual decision. And the evidence has shown that a Citizens Assembly is trusted a lot more than other ways of making decisions, because it's seen as it's done by ordinary people. The decisions are made by us. And as an example, in Ireland, it was used around whether or not to lift the ban on abortion. And no politician wanted to pick that question because it was quite a divisive issue. But by doing it through a citizens' assembly and each of the citizens seeing all the different arguments and coming to a recommendation to lift that ban, there wasn't. It didn't have the same energy. Say, for example, in the Brexit referendum, we've created an us and them divide. It actually created a much more cohesive way because people trusted the process by which it had been done. So that's a key demand. Those three things. The decentralized structure is really important in how we've gone about building the organism, the organization of Extinction Rebellion. So geographically, there are local groups. There are each split between, say, media messaging, advocacy, a political group, a actions group, where the actions group are bringing small groups of people together to come down to London for the civil disobedience. And Jen mentioned about this social ecology, that we are looking very much at both the means of power as well, and disrupting the power framework in order to say that we need to come to that ecological framing. So we're looking at very much, rather than deep ecology, which is much more looking at just the ecological sense of and rights for nature. We're trying to frame it within the social power structures as well, and the power relations, which also need to change. And we're emphasizing three key threads in that. One is the voice of future generations, the global south, and also the voice of nature as well, through the building of the movement. And at the moment, we've now got 50 countries involved, building up to the International Rebellion on October the 7th. And I think the reason why it's gathered force is because of the April Rebellion. In seeing that, during that April Rebellion, I was in the political strategy group, and we were all kind of trying to work out, how do we get from this place of disruption to actually engaging with the political powers that be, and at a key point of the movement, the messaging that was coming out from the newspapers at the beginning was very negative, saying, who are these people? Why do you feel you have a right to block the road? We just want to get on with our business. But as more and more people began seeing what was happening and seeing the creativity, the messaging from the media began changing. They began interviewing more of the people, and then politicians began coming to the stage to show their that they were with us. And then Michael Gove, who was at that time the environment minister, he met with Greta Thunberg, who came also to XR, and she was quite instrumental in getting Michael Gove to agree to meet with Extinction Rebellion. And so that meeting was a key thing. It was videoed, it was distributed then throughout the Extinction Rebellion sort of network, and people saw us as rebels speaking with the government, and the government then, actually Parliament actually declaring a climate and ecological emergency through a parliamentary motion. And that, it shifts the narrative when you see, even though we're not saying that it's carried out the full objectives, because in a way the government is got its own agenda through declaring that motion, because all it's done so far is declare it. It hasn't actually acted upon any of the needs that such a declaration would involve, like not expanding Heathrow, for example. So there have been lots of protests around Heathrow as well. But what people have, it is shifting things to see that following the protests, that things have changed with the government. There has been a recommendation for net zero, too late by 2050, but at least it's been a net zero commitment. And the third demand, Citizens' Assemblies, Parliament has now commissioned the setting up of a Citizens' Assembly, not the Citizens' Assembly we want, net zero by 2025, but a Citizens' Assembly looking at the 2050 deadline. So in each of the demands, they have been met partially, and that has added a lot of energy to the movement, brought more people on board. So so it's that iterative process, I think, which is key, and building it as a civil society movement, I think, is an essential element of it, that ordinary people have got to feel that they are part of this as well. And we're trying to, so I'm also part of Exile Muslims as well, which is, so we're breaking up into lots of different communities of interest as well, so that we can all start working on these different demographics that need to be involved, that the whole country needs to be involved in this. It needs to be, can't just be any one element. The emergency is that huge. I think I think that was all I'll say for now. These are two links here that are to the US Extinction Rebellion. So just that you've got those links there to see if you want to be involved as well. And they've got their rebellion on 20th of September, which is on Earth Strike Day. And in the UK, we've gone slightly later for the October the 7th for our international rebellion.
Wonderful. Let's see. And you can click the stop sharing button, I think, over there.
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And, you know, to me, the Extinction Rebellion really shows how a compelling new environmental movement can, through careful strategy and theory of change, actually result in governments taking steps to protect the planet. And, you know, I think the Extinction Rebellion in particular is a movement whose passion and drive is equal to the scope of the climate change emergency. And hearing Mathieu speak on the Extinction Rebellion really brought to light the careful thought that has gone into the movement. And I think it can teach us a lot about how to get the results we are demanding in our own advocacy and activism. And as he said, everyone mark your calendars for October 7th for the International Rebellion, depending where you are, as well as this Friday, September 20th for the global climate strike. Thank you so much for your insights and for joining us. Next, we have the honor of welcoming Elizabeth Dunn. Elizabeth Dunn graduated from Emory Law School in 2000. She's worked for nonprofits, law firms, and federal judges, and for the past several years has managed her own visionary law practice. And she provides counsel to community groups, governments, and ecosystems defending, enforcing, and enacting laws that advance their fundamental rights. Her former client, Grant Township, Pennsylvania's fight against the fracking industry has been covered in Rolling Stone and Yes Magazine. She recently assisted in drafting the People's Recommendation 74, which recognizes that southern resident orcas have an inherent right to life, including their naturally occurring food source, Chinook from the Snake River. And she also assisted in drafting the Declaration of the Rights of the Southern Resident Orcas. So welcome everyone, Elizabeth, and I will pass it over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Great. Yeah, thanks so far for the wonderful presentations. I'm happy to be on this panel, and I'm going to talk, our theme here is how to change, I think, the social power structure, and that's the main theme that we're hearing. And I'm going to focus on change through knowledge, direct action, and lawmaking, with an emphasis on the latter, because that's where, that's an area where I've been providing support. As Grant said, I represent communities and ecosystems in court, and also assist other attorneys in doing so. And I work in collaboration with organizations such as the Earth Law Center and community groups to give presentations about rights of nature, what it means, and how it works to pass rights of nature laws in communities. So my core belief is that we need as many people as possible to have the tools to do this work. We know that work is challenging because we're confronting the existing paradigm that enslaves nature as property and fails to recognize that our rights are intertwined with and inseparable from the natural world. And we have a right to live in a clean and healthy environment. And that also means that the ecosystem has a right to exist, flourish, and evolve. So we actually have an upcoming workshop in Tacoma, Washington, with Michelle Binder from the Earth Law Center, and the Legal Rights Facility and I are giving a free workshop to introduce as many people as possible to the concepts of rights of nature and a rights-based framework. So, as I think most people, listening to this webinar, we're in a co-extinction crisis, and we've gotten to this place where, in our history, we often, unfortunately, wait until we're in a crisis to actually get to that place where we're at the tipping point to make those changes. I think we've heard some great theories, discussion Jen gave us on change and how change happens. And the good news is that we are seeing change happen because we are in this crisis. And I think the power of visualizing what a world looks like that we want to live in can't be understated. Really visualizing what does that new structure look like? What does that new paradigm look like? With my field being law, I always like to remind that putting these concepts on paper and creating laws is obviously just one piece of changing society, because laws are just really a reflection of how we relate to one another and how we relate to nature. So we wouldn't be seeing changes in our laws without the direct action that we just heard about with the Extinction Rebellion and other movements. I spend a lot of time examining our current legal structures and doctrines to see how they were developed, how they're not serving us, and how they can be changed. And the good news is that we're seeing a lot more people speaking in a way that reflects an understanding of our interconnection with the natural world, and critically thinking about the effectiveness, or should I say lack of effectiveness, of our existing structures. So I thought I'd highlight a few of my experiences and then talk about the work that I've been doing to recognize the rights of the southern resident orchids, the Salish Sea, and the Snake River ecosystem. And I think that these experiences show that the movement lawyering, we aren't looking for an immediate success, and we also redefine what success means. And perhaps, and most importantly, we wouldn't have anything to do if there weren't people coming together to create a movement. So we're thinking through going from the change in society to the change in law and putting these changes in words and drafting the actual law, and then enforcing and defending that law, which doesn't necessarily have to be through the court, as Masir's presentation shows, but presenting the arguments to the judiciary is one way to lend further legitimacy to this new paradigm. So a couple of years ago, I filed a motion on behalf of an ecosystem, which we described as the Crystal Springs ecosystem in Pennsylvania. And that was based on a provision of a charter passed by the people of a small township in Pennsylvania by popular vote, so exercising direct democracy. And that charter included provisions recognizing the people's right to a clean and healthy environment, and also to the ecosystem's right to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. In that instance, we described the ecosystem as including the humans within the ecosystem, so they were the speaking part of the ecosystem. And I worked with some community members who committed to representing the best interests of the ecosystem. But the motion was actually brought in the name of the Crystal Spring ecosystem itself. So emphasizing as one of the core tenets of rights of nature that the ecosystem itself bears rights and can speak in court, can appear in court. And one of the community members provided a declaration describing the ecosystem to the court, to which we also attached photographs. And the goal was, it was actually a beautiful part of the case for me, because the goal was to actually try to convey, give life to the ecosystem when you're in this kind of this cold, hard academic barrier when you're speaking to the court. How do you convey this crisis? How do you convey something that's from even more of like a heart-centered space, not just this analytical, in our legal world, we're stuck in this very analytical realm that doesn't serve us many times. So the judge actually denied the motion and expressed concerns about whether an ecosystem could be a, quote, person or an proper party to appear in a case. But the takeaway was that we had that conversation and that we had a community who exercised their right to direct democracy, passed the charter, and who and then enforced that. So we're normalizing these concepts by having conversations with them within our existing systems, even though they're foreign to how our existing system is structured. I also assisted as counsel in a case involving the Colorado River ecosystem, and that case wasn't based on a law that a community had passed, but was based on seeking recognition and enforcement of the Colorado River ecosystem's constitutional rights, and asked the court to actually recognize the ecosystem as a, quote, person, really meaning as a rights-bearing entity. That was short-lived because the Colorado Attorney General threatened sanctions against the attorney who was counsel of record in that case, and that complaint was withdrawn. I worked on the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which was recently passed by popular vote in February 2019 by the people of Toledo, Ohio. And that recognizes the rights of the Lake Erie and Lake Erie ecosystem to exist, flourish, and evolve, as well as to the people of Toledo to a clean and healthy environment. And again, the interconnection between those two, which we don't have that recognition in our Western legal constructs for the most part at this time. I was primarily involved in the litigation team that worked just to get the measure on the ballot, which took a few years, which really ties into something Jen mentioned, which is who has the power, because the efforts to keep the measure off the ballot illustrate the efforts to keep the power from the people. But eventually got on the ballot and passed. And so I haven't been part of the defense efforts post-enactment, but one of the inspiring aspects to note is that the city of Toledo has actually stepped in to defend the bill along with the community and the ecosystem. So that to me is an indicator of one thing, the dire state of Lake Erie, which is incredibly polluted and impacted people's drinking water. And two, the fact that the more people that are involved in grassroots efforts to advance these truths, the more our elected leaders and government officials will listen, and the faster change will occur. So turning to my work in the Pacific Northwest, I'm currently focusing on some interrelated rights-based efforts, which, as I mentioned earlier, fortunately the Earth Law Center are also part of campaigns that they are working on. So I've been trying to lend my experience where possible to advancing the rights of the southern resident orcas, which are on the brink of extinction, have garnered worldwide attention for that unfortunate fact, and also the rights of the Salish Sea and the Snake River ecosystems, which are all interconnected. And I came to focus on this work through my work with a strategic campaign to breach the lower Snake River dams with a grassroots group called Dam Sense, that just has a website, damsense.org, and whose mission is to reveal the truth about why it's so imperative to breach the lower Snake River dams, which are killing endangered salmon, particularly Chinook, upon which the southern resident orcas depend for survival. It wasn't long before I realized that this situation truly illustrated the shortcomings of our existing environmental laws and cried out for new frameworks that would change the conversation we were having. Because litigation has gone on for literally decades under our National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, with some success in the terms of the fact that the court has said you need to do more studies. You haven't adequately studied these issues, but that's not a success in the fact that they're doing more studies. Meanwhile, the salmon and the orcas are going extinct. So the current study, which everyone's been waiting for, is also going to say the same thing. We know that's not going to prevent extinction. And there's also been some direct action components to people gathering at Free the Snake flotillas and events to try to illustrate the crisis that we're in here in this situation. And unfortunately, what we've seen is some alignment between the industry and trade associations, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that owns and operates the 4 lower Snake River dams in eastern Washington, and also what I would describe as mainstream environmental groups that really perpetuates the system that is failing us, the system of environmental regulatory law that is not accessible and is not addressing the crisis that we're in, and truly reflecting the interconnection between humans and the environment. Our governor in Washington Inslee, set up an orca task force with the stated goal of preventing the extinction of the southern resident orcas, but I think many of us have seen this before. A lot of the members of the task force have their own compromised special interests. But the good thing is that the fact that there was a task force created a public forum to allow for demonstrations and protests and public comment to speak the truth. And sitting through a lot of those meetings, what I heard people saying is to tell Governor Inslee to take a stand to the dams now, but also to say, questioning who is speaking for the orca and who is speaking in the orca's best interest. And that gave rise to People's Recommendation 74, which is a recommendation because the Orca Task Force was making recommendations, but not really in the best interest. So we got together and the people decided to make their own recommendation of what needed to be done in breaching the dams. But in terms, using the language, rights-based language, so recognizing that the orcas have inherent rights to life, and also that included a right to their naturally occurring food source, which is Chinook from the Snake River. And that was presented at a rally, about 200 people at a rally at the Capitol to the governor by the people. So looking for opportunities to use these to change the paradigm and change the conversation and take situations that are within the normal framework and make them your own, to call to light the recognition of inherent rights. And there was nobody that was truly there in the best interest of the southern resident orcas that questioned the concept that they should be recognized as having inherent rights, or even questioned that the ecosystems should be recognized as having inherent rights. So I've also been working with a group called Legal Rights for Salish Sea. The Earth Law Center has been a huge part of supporting this effort to advance the rights of southern residents by drafting a declaration. And I just try to lend my experience from working and defending other laws to drafting language and putting these concepts in writing. And the intent there is really to just get people to be thinking, that knowledge aspect, educating people about thinking in this way, and then taking concrete actions to advance, secure, and protect these rights at the local level and at the state level. And we're looking at state legislation to do that as well. Yes Magazine recently published an article on August 30th, 2019, about this concept. It's called "Could Rights of Nature Help the Endangered Orcas?" So it's great to see that these more and more people becoming familiar with these ideas. Related to that, I've been assisting with efforts to recognize the rights of the Snake River, one which would be a right to flow, hence removal of the dams, and working with tribal nations and local communities to recognize these rights. And we're seeing some really exciting movements in that direction. I think we'd all love for things to be happening even faster, but it is happening, which is good, because I think the United States is behind in recognizing the rights of rivers and in the rights of nature movement in general. And I'll note that recently the York Tribe in California passed a resolution recognizing the rights of the Klamath River. So, yeah, I think my takeaway message is that we see success every time there's another person who learns about a rights-based approach and that understanding becomes action. And we hear a lot nowadays, and we see that we're talking about here today is action. That action component is essential. So as a part of the paradigm shifting movement, we need to know and trust our collaborators, and we all need to come together and collaborate to succeed. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I've been working with Elizabeth on Rights of Rivers work, and Michelle Bender, our Ocean Rights Manager at Earth Law Center, has been working with her on rights of southern resident orcas, as you heard. And Elizabeth is a very brave and forward-thinking lawyer who for years has challenged the legal system head-on with the goal of fighting for our environment. And, I think we need to learn from her, because we do need the next generation of lawyers, judges, politicians, all the way up to Supreme Courts and constitutional courts to be brave, to make brave choices. and to become part of the effort to protect our planet. And lawyers like Elizabeth can help inspire them to make that happen. And for all professions, no matter what you do, you can introduce advocacy and activism into your own work, and I encourage you to do so. Finally, we have Aeneas Wilfredo Martinez Santos from El Salvador to speak on grassroots movements to protect ecosystems in El Salvador, and to speak on rights of nature from a new perspective. And Aeneas pre-recorded his video in Spanish in order to speak more elegantly on the topic. I'm going to play his speech with subtitles, or if you speak Spanish or sort of speak it like me, follow along in his native language. The video is 10 minutes long, flat, so I encourage you to watch it and stick around for the Q&A very shortly. And an introduction, Aeneas Wilfredo Martinez Santos is a leading environmental lawyer in El Salvador. He helped secure approval of a 2019 proclamation in the Legislative Assembly of El Salvador declaring forests to be living entities with certain human obligations to protect and restore forests. He also recently published the book Cultural Mandate: From Conventions to New Paradigms, The Rights of Nature. And Aeneas also served as a consultant for the preparation of the Framework Law on Climate Change for El Salvador in 2017, and was a legal advisor for the Environmental Fund of El Salvador 2018. More recently, he became president of Yes for the Rights of Nature, a movement in El Salvador, and his numerous papers can be found on his website. And I am going to post in the chat here a link to the organization's website and his own personal one. Oops, hold on, I sent it to the wrong person. Here you go, which I encourage everyone to take a look at. So hold on one second, I'm gonna share my screen with this video. And Aeneas is also here in the audience, so thank you for joining us. Just one moment. Let's see here, okay. Okay, someone tell me if you cannot see it. Maybe shout at me. I'm going to assume you can see it unless people start shouting at me. Okay, here we go.
Un saludo a todos los participantes de este importante encuentro donde compartiremos experiencias y conocimientos alrededor del activismo y la defensa de la naturaleza, sobre los nuevos movimientos de las leyes por la naturaleza. Un agradecimiento en particular a Grant Wilson del Earth Law Center por la oportunidad que me da de poder ser parte de este importante espacio donde podemos hablar un poco acerca de lo que hemos hecho en El Salvador por los derechos de la naturaleza. Thanks a lot, Wilson, for inviting me to participate of this webinar. I'm so grateful with you. Thanks. Mi nombre es Aeneas Martínez, del Salvador, como ya les comentaba. El tema por los derechos de la naturaleza, nuestra decisión de trabajar este tema en nuestro país, que valga decir es nuevo y que no nos da orgullo, sino que nos da satisfacción y nos hace que seamos mejores cada vez. Somos la única organización que está trabajando, promoviendo los derechos de la naturaleza en nuestro país. Esta iniciativa nace allá por el mes de agosto del año recién pasado, cuando haciendo algunas investigaciones y participando en una actividad en Colombia, pudimos escuchar un poco más a fondo sobre este tema de los derechos de la naturaleza. Y coincide en que este viaje que realizamos a Bogotá iba paralelo con una comunicación que ya habíamos establecido con el Earth Law Center, con Darlene y posteriormente con Grant. Entonces surge la iniciativa de convocar a personas que estén interesadas en conformar un colectivo que quiera trabajar los derechos de la naturaleza en El Salvador. Es así como conformamos este equipo que denominamos Sí por la Naturaleza, que pueden encontrar en Facebook bajo ese nombre. Somos un equipo de alrededor de 18 personas, entre mujeres y hombres, todos relativamente jóvenes, algunos ya con carrera, otros aún pues, en su etapa de universidad. Hay de diferentes disciplinas, entre abogados, sociólogos, ingenieros, y también decirles de que hay participantes de comunidades, líderes comunitarios, que tienen mucha experticia en cuanto a la organización comunitaria y al activismo. Entonces decidimos unirnos y comenzamos con pequeñas reuniones, tomándonos un café y dándole forma a esta iniciativa que al día de hoy pues ya tiene alrededor de un año, y contarles que pues ya hemos hecho algunas cosas. Entre quizás las más significativas por el momento, comentarles que hemos venido trabajando con Grant, una declaratoria sobre los derechos de los bosques de El Salvador. Nosotros que apuntamos en esta oportunidad a la Asamblea Legislativa, pues era la entidad encargada de aprobar este tipo de declaratoria. Sin embargo, después de que tuvimos una serie de reuniones, porque hay que reconocer que la Asamblea Legislativa nos tomó la palabra en este tema, sobre todo algunas de las fracciones, principalmente dentro de la Asamblea, nos invitaron a reuniones donde se discutió la propuesta, de qué se trataba, los pros, los contras, y al final pues no se logró que se aprobara la propuesta como tal, la declaratoria como tal, pero el 5 de junio, que es el Día Mundial del Medio Ambiente, logramos que la Asamblea Legislativa emitiera un pronunciamiento en el cual se reconoce a los bosques como entidades vivientes y se hace un llamado a trabajar por vivir en armonía con la naturaleza, entre otras exhortaciones a contribuir a un medio ambiente sano para que asimismo nosotros también vivamos saludables. En este momento estamos trabajando en otro aspecto más local en el departamento de Ahuachapán, que es el departamento de donde yo procedo y donde vivo, por la laguna El Espino. La laguna es un bien hídrico histórico, han pasado generaciones y generaciones conociendo esa laguna. Yo nací a pocos metros de esa laguna, me bañaba, pescaba, pero ahora la laguna está casi ya convertida en un foco de contaminación con miles de habitantes a su alrededor que ejercen una presión ecológica que la está destruyendo. Entonces estamos trabajando, promoviendo el reconocimiento de la laguna como una entidad viviente y que tiene derechos. Y para esto también Grant, el Earth Law Center, nos ha estado dando apoyo técnico jurídico. Ya tenemos la propuesta de declaratoria, ya la hemos trabajado, la hemos traducido, y por el momento estamos en la etapa de recolección de firmas de la población aledaña y de todo tipo de personas que estén interesados y que reconozcan la importancia de este bien natural. Estamos preparando ya un paquete para presentarlo a la autoridad municipal, al Consejo Municipal. Hemos tenido ya conversaciones con más de uno de los concejales que nos han dado su apoyo para poder introducir el tema en el Consejo Municipal. Estamos muy optimistas, puesto que hemos tenido muy buena recepción por parte de la población en cuanto a la recolección de firmas. Que quiero también, en nombre de nuestro equipo, comentarles que pues nos promovemos a través de una fanpage en Facebook, pero también hacemos trabajo territorial, nos abocamos a las comunidades, hemos levantado información de temas que para nosotros son importantes y que en su momento vamos a retomar, así como el tema de la Laguna del Espino. Tenemos el reconocimiento de gente importante dentro del quehacer quizás ambiental, político dentro del país, y pues no pensamos parar, pensamos continuar, seguir adelante. Este es un tema nuevo en El Salvador, como decía al principio, nos honramos en ser la única organización en que promueva este tema de los derechos de la naturaleza. Así que no nos detenemos, seguimos. Aguachapán, El Salvador, está conociendo que existimos y que existe un mecanismo novedoso que es tendencia en el mundo para poder darle a la naturaleza el lugar que merece. No estamos por sobre la naturaleza, sino que somos parte de ella. La visión antropocéntrica con la que se ha gestionado los recursos la está destruyendo, pero creo que trabajar para que las instancias judiciales, legislativas, reconozcan que la naturaleza es una entidad viviente y tiene derechos, no tiene precio. También, para finalizar, comentarles que a nivel judicial hemos tenido contactos y pláticas con uno de los, y el único magistrado de cámara, como le llamamos acá, ambiental, sobre este tema, y hemos ya comenzado a trabajar para establecer algunas reuniones de trabajo, porque él también conoce de este tema y está contento, nos lo ha manifestado, de que nosotros seamos pioneros en el trabajo y en el activismo en este tema. Él está pensando, me lo manifestaba, en trabajar, en reconocer los derechos de la naturaleza desde las resoluciones judiciales. Así que nosotros, como Sí por la Naturaleza, estamos aquí trabajando en El Salvador y, como repito, no pensamos detenernos. Nuevamente reiterar mi agradecimiento por la invitación y compartir este breve resumen de las cosas que estamos haciendo en El Salvador. Hasta pronto.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for that speech. You know, if you want to learn how to build a movement from scratch, an environmental movement from scratch, you really have to see what Aeneas and his colleagues have done, which we just heard about. I've almost seen nothing like it. You know, they move so quickly and are very effective. It was less than a year ago that we started communicating for the first time about rights of nature work in El Salvador. And since then, he's built a thriving movement, got a proclamation passed, and has really come a long ways. And I think observing from the outside, a lot of it is about building community around a common cause. And you really have to go and check out their Facebook page and you'll see what I mean. They're constantly engaging the community directly in projects and work outdoors. And I think part of it is that he and his group inspire people to expect more from their country. And people are becoming inspired. So thank you. Please go online and follow their group, as I said, and take note of them and see what they're doing. And I think that can inspire you in your own work. And I really do believe El Salvador, based on the successes they've seen just in the last year, can become one of the leaders in the rights of nature movement to the extent they are not already. So that was our last speaker. We heard from a diverse group of people today about some emerging trends, strategies, and experiences from advocates and activists. So I hope as you listened, you asked yourself about what you can do better with your own advocacy, your own activism, to protect the planet and its people? I sure asked myself those questions today and have a lot of exciting follow-up to do after today's presentation. So now we're going to open up to Q&A. It really is going to be a discussion, so feel free to chime in or give a few thoughts or whatever you'd like. And you're also welcome to follow up with speakers individually. Let me quickly ask, is there anyone who doesn't want this part to be recorded? And that's totally fine. If so, just say something now or send me a private message and I'll stop the recording. Or if everyone is okay with the recording continuing for the Q&A, we'll keep it on. Okay, well for now, I'll keep it on, but if you change your mind, message me. I can turn it off anonymously even. We have a few questions that were asked in the chat, so I'm gonna quickly start with those. If the people who gave those presentations are still online, they can answer them. If not, we'll just open it up for general answers. And after those few questions are asked, we'll just open up the floor to anyone at all who has a question. Okay, so the first one I have here is for Mathieu. How can this type of activism confront countries like the United States, where they are beginning to criminalize protest or certain types of protests? Or is there an element of violence or threat of violence by alt protesters and even the police, i.e. in the US and Hong Kong? So that will be our first question. Then I think we have one more after this, and we'll open it up generally.
Yeah, very good question. Each country has a different regime and different ways in which of engaging with the police, and we're actually seeing a bit of the police strengthening and under a Boris Johnson regime. They've just carried out some preemptive arrests on some of the Extinction Rebellion. One of the co-founders, actually, Roger Hammer, I just mentioned, he's now in custody for at least a few months, probably. And actually, he's just released a message saying, carry on forward. This is my sacrifice as part of the movement. And when you look at the suffragettes, when you look at many other movements, there have been people who sacrificed their freedom for a larger cause, and he is doing that as a moral position. And whichever country we're in, it is the civil society seeing that sacrifice which builds up the moral outrage. And so I think it is part of the Gene Sharp's theory of change as well, around civil disobedience. So the fear is, and coming up, grasping that fear and coming over that fear together, whichever jurisdiction you're in, is part of that, the challenges to be faced.
Great, thank you. The next question I have is for Elizabeth. The question is, how does this intersect with how organizations and corporations are given rights similar to individuals? Are there reasons why they won't use that as a framework for ecosystems? The irony is that organizations like to call themselves ecosystems, but the law will not recognize ecosystems. I appreciate your work. So.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think I saw in the chat thread that Lindsay Shulman-Warren posted a good general response to that as well. But so I will say, yeah, there's definitely, we do use the discussion of corporate rights to say in a couple ways. One is that some of these local laws, particularly ones that have been passed with the assistance of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, do contain provisions that restrict or limit or basically take away corporate rights as persons, particularly if the corporation is violating or seeking to violate the law. And that was a provision of the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. So that directly addresses that issue. And what we've been, and we also use it as to make a comparison when we're speaking to the courts to say, you know, how does this make sense that corporations have these rights and when ecosystems don't have these rights as living beings? And I think equally or maybe more important, the conversation what we tried to argue in courts is that corporate rights currently are obviously held far above the rights of ecosystems, and so we argue in comparing rights that that doesn't make sense. Rights of communities and ecosystems should be, even if corporations are recognized as having some limited rights, many of the rights that corporations are recognized as having make no sense, and there are some groups that are opposed to corporate rights and corporate personhood in general, but that you certainly shouldn't be advancing the rights of corporations above the rights of communities and ecosystems. And so that's been a part of that conversation. I will say in a case representing Grant Township, township in Pennsylvania, who their story has been covered in Rolling Stone and Yes Magazine. The oil company there challenged the law, and part of the law said that the corporation did not have certain rights, and they then also used the corporations recognized constitutional rights to then put pressure on the township, and argued that its corporate rights had been violated, and actually did so successfully. And the court ended up finding that in favor of the corporation, and that its constitutional rights had actually been violated by this law that said that it couldn't dump factory waste in the community. So that's what we're up against. Also part of that, the court went further to say what I essentially arguing that community rights should take precedence over corporate rights was sanctionable, and sanctioned the attorneys, myself was one of them in the case, for making what the court considered to be a frivolous argument. So that conversation is being had, and it's a really interesting one. It's a really important part of this, I think.
Great, thank you. And our next question comes from a classroom. That's awesome. I wish I got to go to this sort of thing when I was in school. So the question is from a class in Salisbury, North Carolina, open to anybody, is do any of you think religion or any other spiritual beliefs could be a useful tool to change the mindset of its believers to take better care of the earth? We already had one response from David saying spirituality in the sense of the creative spirit creating order and love on earth could be a good start. And I open this question up to the speakers or anyone else who wants to give thoughts about the place of religion or spiritual beliefs as a tool to change the mindsets of people and better protect the earth.
I would respond to that. This is Jen here. It seems to me that it's very important, like how people's value system and meaning is very very powerful in what they're willing to do, what they're willing to take on and stand up for. But at the same time, it's a difficult strategy because we've learned from Western history that it's pretty bad to impose religious beliefs on, promote them. So that's a bit tricky. So it's something that needs to come. People need to come to themselves, and there's no saying what the right beliefs are. So, or who gets to decide what the right beliefs are. That's very ethically problematic. So, I would say it's powerful, but not something that could be imposed from outside of individuals.
I just had a brief response to that, and that is if you're following what's been happening on Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii, where I used to live, I think that's an amazing example of the intersection between religion and sacred spaces and caring for our natural world and the interconnection between humans and the natural world. So.
I'll just make a quick comment on that because I'm just it's an area that interests me a lot. And when you think about the European story of the religious wars in the 13th century, that then led to the idea of state sovereignty through the Treaty of Westphalia. You can see that thing of like, oh, we have to have this secular notion, principle, because of religious power and political power coming together. And we've got to a point now where we get triggered by that, by the idea of religion. It has to be outside political power. But what we are doing within XR particularly is saying it's denuded the spiritual element so much that actually, well, the Christian groups and Jewish and Muslims are now coming together to say we need to actually gather ourselves, because there is no other moral force that actually has that strength. And so we gather, and as ex-R Muslim myself, I'm trying to represent Muslims as a model of stewardship rather than domination. You could say that was within a Western hegemony of kind of values of domination of nature. There's always been a stewardship model in Islam, which I'm only discovering myself, actually. I'm getting quite interested in. But yeah, this moral force that has always been, I guess, behind a lot of other social change movements, and how do we gather ourselves behind that and allow ourselves to stand there more than just individual, but as a political voice as well.
Great answer and very good question. And there's another response there from Katie in the chat. Is that a response or also a question? We are ready for our next question. If anyone has one, shout, or it's a response.
Hi, Grant.
Hi.
Hi. Good. Should I start?
Please, yeah, jump in there.
Okay, good. Well, one of the conflicts, in a sense, when we're looking at present-day law, we have very top-down centralized law that follows a colonial tradition. That's our whole structure of law. Whereas when we look at indigenous law, imagine if we had just arrived in the Americas and we're arriving as refugees from the failure that we had created in Europe. And so the oligarchs who ran Europe shipped us over as refugees to this country because of the failure there. But unfortunately, our whole system of laws is a recreation of the laws, of the colonial laws that we had in Europe. So the indigenous law is based more in what would be called fractal components. And the first fractal is based in the 100-person multi-home that we find on Turtle Island, North America, and all our indigenous ancestors around the world, including Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa, everywhere. And if we look at this kind of local organization, we're looking at the 100-person multi-home, and we're also looking at the production society guilds. And I would suggest developing a parallel track in empowerment of people. And the parallel track would look at how do we empower everyone right where they live and work. And that's to do with the string shell accounting system that was also used on every continent and island and nation of the world before colonization. So it's just a whole area that I don't believe people here have probably got a background in, but it's a wonderful area of huge empowerment. The most successful corporations, the most profitable corporations, the most environmentally performing corporations in the world are based in participation of all stakeholders. And there's lots more to be said on that, but thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Great points, and we have so much to learn from indigenous communities. They're the leaders in so many environmental movements, and indigenous rights and rights of nature go hand in hand so closely. So I appreciate your thoughts on this, and welcome anyone to respond to that, or it can be food for thought to consider in your own work. And if you didn't see, Douglas Jack sent out some great resources at the start of the chat from his website. And let me see if I can find that here. Here it is. If it's okay, I'm going to paste it again here. Really will, I think, is useful for, really is useful for challenging some of your basic assumptions in your own work, in your own theory of change. It's very difficult to remove a colonial mindset from even environmental campaigns that are well-meaning to protect the planet, and I think it's really important to challenge ourselves to do so. So check out those resources, and thank you for the comments. The floor is open for anyone else to speak. I think we'll go to 3:15 or 5:15 Eastern, so about a little under 15 more minutes. Or if the well is dry, we can wrap up early.
Hi, Grant.
Hi.
I could add some examples. Around the world, we find that 70% of people live in multi-home dwelling complexes. That's the great good way of kindness, or the great law of peace of the Haudenosaunee here in Tiohtià:ke. Based their law actually in this local empowerment. And it turns out today that around the world, 70% of populations live in multi-home dwelling complexes, apartments, townhouses, and village areas. The word Canada comes from the Mohawk word Ganada, meaning village. And so around the world, 70% of us live in multi-homes, and the average size is still 100 people. We look at multi-homes around the world, the average size is 100 people living in about 32 dwelling complexes, 32 dwellings in a complex. So what that does is it shows that the basic human efficiencies have not been totally lost. We don't have the ecological design of our indigenous ancestors. We don't have the productivity that they had, and we don't have the peaceful resolution techniques such as in the council process that they used. But what it shows is that today, and companies like the Keiretsu of Japan, the Chaebol of North Korea, the participatory economy of Europe, companies like Huawei are participatory companies, and they are capturing the world market because they have collective intelligence. Those of us working in the environmental movement can work with these economies and these voices. We are the voice of the earth speaking, and that's what indigenous people have told us. And this is how we empower it, is through our relations. Thank you.
Thank you, great. And we are the voice of ecosystems and have to use that voice loudly and in defense of what we can.
Can I make or open with an exploration?
Please.
Yeah, just around the chat and around, we do have so many different cultures, I guess, and ways of approaching our understanding, our worldview. And then we have the legal structures that are underlying that, and they've also come through particular cultures. So our understanding of property, personhood, and so I'm just trying to tie it to some of the discussions that I've seen in the panel around personhood and corporations, and also just around the language of rights, which to me has come from a very Western hegemonic kind of sense of that as an individual, I must have a right, I have a right to do this, and then it's attached to corporations, and this language of accountability and responsibility that is, and we can see that within the idea of duty holders, who hold, as well as rights holders, we have duty holders, and who are the institutions and entities that have those, who are the duty holders. So we have the state as a fiction in a way that holds some duties, and we almost take that for granted now. And we have to begin, I think, to rethink some of the ways and work within existing cultural systems and the language that we are used to. Because I'm finding in England, it's been quite difficult to get rights of nature through arguments through, and whether there are other ways in which we can try to bring the same equivalent accountability, but whether there are other ways of thinking about it by looking at the legal concepts that underlie rights, and whether anybody's thought about that, of looking at different other ways of approaching it.
I could briefly address some of that. I think those are really good points. I mean, I think that what I struggle with is the limitations we have with our language. And I think you're right on when we talk about this rights-based framework. And I think that I'm always thinking we need to emphasize the responsibility and the stewardship aspect just as much as this right, because we've had so much ingrained of, I have a right to this, I have a right to that, I have a right to use my property however I want. And that's a part of the problem. And so I definitely think there's room for creating new language around, and entirely new language around this, actually, to better, maybe even better reflect what we need to do to make the change. I think it's that balance between working within our system and the language that we know and we use in the Western system, and how we're working within that to introduce these concepts versus, and along with coming up with entirely new ways of expressing it.
I agree. I think rights is one way to give a voice to nature in our governance. There's other ways to do it as well. Nature can have political bodies and have a voice in that method. We can have the responsibilities to nature, and that's another way to give it a voice or uphold its integrity. Nature could vote. There's scientific ways to do that, and there's ways through guardians to do that. And guardianship is another way to give nature a voice. I think, to me, that's the most compelling part about rights of nature is it's able to participate in our government, and it's able to advocate for its own interests, whereas under the status quo that's not the case. Really good question, and I think the language will evolve, and right now we're trying to fit nature within our current legal system, and that's why we have some of these messy terms that were made for humans, and now we're trying to apply to nature. And I think eventually we have to fit within the realm of the greater health of ecosystems and fit our institutions within that framework instead of the other way around. I'm going to move on to the question about from the college, and it was, I lost it, but basically it was we as young people who are interested in the fields. Okay, here we go. What advice do you have for students who are just starting out in environmental policy and ecological law fields? So this is an open question to the panel and anyone else. What do students do right now today?
I have a response to that. I feel like we're in an emergency situation globally, and so I think there's ways to do research, and that responds to that urgency. And I think the way to do that is through action research, and particularly action research. So check that out. There's lots of good books and trainings on that. So the idea is that you do research in collaboration with community and organizations and others on the ground who are working to change the world, and you do research in ways that actually lead to action and, in collaboration with those groups, and then you reflect on to what extent that action was successful in making change or not. So I think that's about the highest leverage kind of research in this emergency moment. So I would urge you all to look into that as a research approach.
I'd like to make a comment here. I've been working in Ecuador, and I found that I, as a citizen of the world, have a duty within the Ecuadorian Rights of Nature Constitution to uphold and represent nature. So in that sense, I've been able to bring a case into the Ecuadorian courts for the protection of the waterways of the upper Amazon threatened by the tailings dam of the Mirador mine. So for students, I would say it would be interesting to look through constitutions like the Ecuadorian Constitution, like the Bolivian Constitution, and see where we can fit our duty to protect the environment within which we live. Okay, that's my comment.
Great, thank you. I'll add really practically, we take student volunteers all the time. Earth Law Center, my email is gwilson@earthlaw.org. So you're welcome to email me, and if you're interested in the work we do, and I can get you signed up on. Okay, maybe one more question, and then after that, if people want to stick around and just have an informal conversation, they're welcome to. I'm looking at a question here. I apologize, but does anyone have one right now they want to ask? And then we'll conclude, but leave the line open for those who want to stay. Okay, well, maybe we'll formally conclude then. Just a couple of things. Once again, be sure to sign up on the Google Doc if you haven't yet. We'll post it one more time here at the bottom in just a moment. This video is going to be available online, so I encourage you to share it with your colleagues and keep the conversation going. I think everyone here has a genuine interest in this topic and wants to not only learn from others to better their own practices, and so I hope that we keep this conversation going. I just pasted the Google Doc there to make sure you sign up for more information. I sincerely thank everyone for coming, especially the presenters who shared the wisdom that they've learned through their own practices, which was very inspiring. And to end, I'll state a Margaret Mead quote. And the fact that you Google quotes about activism, and this is the first one that comes up, does not detract from its power or its truth, but that does happen to be the case. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So I hope many of us who spent time here today can be that small but growing group for the planet. And thank you once again, everyone, for joining. I'll leave the chat open for a minute in case you want to go back through the comments and jot down anything, because once I close it, those are deleted. And feel free to follow up by email or any other way with me or any of the participants here. And thank you again so much for everyone who joined, participated, and otherwise engaged in this event. Thanks, everyone.
So, yeah, I don't know. Welcome, everybody, to the first webinar in our Environmental Law and Governance webinar series for 2019, co-sponsored by the Ecological Law and Governance Association, and several other organizations, including the one that I'm working with, the Economics for the Anthropocene Partnerships Law and Governance Research Initiative. I'll have more to say about this entire webinar series. We have an exciting program going all the way through till December. I am wearing two hats here today. One is a steering member of the Ecological Law and Governance Association, and the other as a coordinator of E4A's Law and Governance Research Initiative. ELGA was started in 2016 as a global umbrella group to link various organizations and individuals interested in promoting and learning more about ecological law and governance. Economics for the Anthropocene Partnership was started in 2014 and has an array of activities, which I'm not going to get into too much detail, but one of these is looking at how we can rethink and reground normative disciplines like law and governance, and that's the work that I've been coordinating for the last few years. It's exciting to be linked up this way to people at the McGill Law faculty who are there in person, and also at Vermont Law School, and then Zoom participants. This is extremely exciting from all around the world. Just a brief set of things to think about before we